All right, so this is my first official attempt at creating my own YouTube video for theological content. I have watched many of Father Mike Schmidt's videos, and I've always been impressed by the content, very grateful for what he does. I had no idea how much work he probably has to do behind the scenes to get him so good. But Father Mike Schmitz, you are the man on a whole new level after I've had experience with this. This is my second time recording this. The first time I had one of my staff review it, and let's just say you're really fortunate that I didn't post that as the first one. But what we're going to do today is basically set down some of the foundations for what will be essentially the next 14 posts for the first set of rules of discernment of Ignatius of Loyola. And then after that will be the next 8 lessons of discernment of spirits for Ignatius of Loyola. In this time of corona, quarantine, social isolation, etc., we as a society are given a very unique opportunity to basically have for us a lot of our distractions cut out from our life because everything's getting canceled. Unfortunately, some people have lost their jobs, their forms of livelihood. Other people, everything's just on hold, their travel plans, their business plans, they're working from home. And so this is just a very unique time in basically our society as a whole. And I think one in God's providence that is going to allow us to go very deep in the spiritual life. And so what I want to do is to give some tools to be able to navigate these possibly new waters for the person who's seeking to go deep in the spiritual life. What Ignatius of Loyola's rules of discernment offer us is basically as we start to look at the movements of the soul, we will actually begin to find that we're kind of swayed to certain things, other things are moving around. How do we know if we're in God's graces, if God is speaking to us, if he's not? How do we know if we're making a good decision, a bad decision? All these sorts of things, Ignatius and his rules of discernment have sorted out over the years, and they're phenomenal. And so I really want to walk through these to kind of help us to navigate these interior waters. Now, the first thing, just to set up as a premise, is the reality that this process of going internal and deep can oftentimes be very disorienting. And the reason why is, right, we're used to functioning on our 5 senses as the means of operation. What we can see, hear, taste, smell, touch, these sorts of things are what we use on a daily basis to navigate the world around us. Now to say, okay, I realize that I can't go very far out in the world around me. I'm kind of socially isolated, quarantined. Now I have to go deep within. And this is actually a hard process because it involves spiritual senses that may have not been developed at all in our life. Our physical senses, we need to survive. Our spiritual senses oftentimes go underdeveloped because we can still function, maybe not at the full level of the human person, but we can function without them. And so we could seriously be very old in our, temporal age and yet be very immature in our spiritual development. And so possibly this time could be that one time in your life where the Lord has given you this opportunity to start to minister and to nourish to that part of you that you've neglected for years. Or if you are spiritually advanced and deep, maybe this will just be a refinement of some of the things that the Lord has been doing all along. Now, the thing that illuminated me to these rules of discernment was a program called the Institute for Priestly Formation. And they did a phenomenal job teaching about how to do the Ignatian exercises. And as I begin to learn these rules of discernment, what I was amazed by is that they actually give kind of confines or guardrails so that you know where you're going and how you know if you kind of went over the guardrail and you're kind of going off into a precipice. And so I'm very grateful for the formation that I received through them. And some of this stuff will actually be from Father Timothy Gallagher. Other things will be from talks that I've heard. Very little of the content is actually from me. And so one of the things that I've learned in the beauty of our Catholic tradition is if someone has already said it before, it's probably safe that you're not going off the guardrails because you're not inventing new theology. So very little of this, if any, is my own. Back in my high school years, in the year 2000, I was a a sophomore in high school, graduated 2003 from Lakeville North. And I was in a program called Aquatic Biology. And I was one of those nerds that loved science. I loved anatomy and physiology and just learning about botany and just creatures all around. And this anatomy and physiology class, it was culminating in a trip that we would take to Costa Rica in the summer. And basically, we were going to go through all 4 ecosystems in Costa Rica. And the reason why we were having kind of these pre-classes before the trip was to teach us how complicated the environment was in Costa Rica. Now, what I was amazed at is so many of these ecosystems are interdependent. If one plant species or pH level or even an animal goes extinct, it can actually ripple through all 4 ecosystems. Now, what this taught me, and then now growing in some of the spiritual tradition, is the same thing is actually true on the level of the soul. We have different ecosystems within ourselves. We have the physical world and we have the spiritual world. And they actually are meant to work with one another in harmony. We are both body and soul. However, ever since the fall, things kind of got ripped apart, and there's almost a war at the two. St. Paul talks about, right? Why do I know the good that I should do, but I don't do it? It's like there's these 2 forces in my body that are warring. And so these ecosystems, our body and soul, they don't always work well together. And we experience this, right? Where sometimes you can have everything that we want in this world, and we're not happy. And yet, there are times where everything's deprived of us, like this current social situation with the pandemic. And it's like, I'm actually at peace, even though everything's falling apart. And so it's just very bizarre how these internal processes are working. Now, in the spiritual life, our kind of descent into the spiritual life, it's not intuitive. It has to be learned. And St. Teresa of Avila, in one of her masterpieces called The Interior Castle, she gives this marvelous expose of how to descend deeper and deeper into the interior life. Teresa of Avila says, and she's writing this book to her sisters who are in a convent. They're literally, essentially quarantined, they're cloistered, and there's usually about 16 of them, and they can't leave the grounds. They're there for their entire life. One of the famous saints is St. Therese of Lisieux, and she deeply desired to be a missionary, but she knew that the Lord was calling her into this cloister. And so what she would do throughout her very short 24 years of life was, rather than to go out to all the mission fields throughout the world, she would go deep within, and in that communion with Christ, would begin to pray and intercede for all of those who were out in the fields of the missions. This same opportunity is available to all of us. It's what the ancients have called the capax Dei, or it's the capacity for God. That each human being has the capacity to hold God within themselves. And in fact, we do this, right? Every single time we celebrate the Eucharist, is the fullness of God comes within our very heart. And so Teresa of Avila, in tracing the descent, goes through 7 different castles. But the first one is actually called the Courtyard of the Senses. And in this, she has reptiles and serpents and spiders and things crawling around, and they're biting people, they're poisoning them and keeping them from descending. Now, of course, what she's talking about, right, is all of the social sins that we get involved with, whether that's anger or lust or gossip or envy or jealousy. These things bite us and prevent us from descending deeper into union with God within. We are temples of the Holy Spirit. And at the very core of ourself is the throne where God is seated. And nothing can replace him. It's his chair of honor. And he's just waiting to be enthroned inside of your heart. Now, in speaking about the landscape of the soul, it is helpful to realize that the soul is not temporal or physical. And here's why this is important. Our souls, they don't just fit to our body size. They could be far bigger than our body or far smaller than our body. The soul actually grows or it atrophies based upon how we are nourishing it, just like our body does. And so what we're going to be amazed at, right, is after we pass from this world to the next, is what our souls actually look like. If you're interested in doing kind of a fictional read during your downtime, I highly recommend Oscar Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray. And the reason why is it has this brilliant expose between what does the external look like and then this picture that Dorian Gray has of what his soul looks like. And it begins to kind of bring you into the mindset that says, wow, just because I might look normal on the outside, there might be something really different going on inside of my soul. And so us actually engaging this soul work will increase our soul's ability to grow, and hopefully not to shrink through this, but to actually grow and expand. And this is actually where the saints perform so many miracles, is their souls were so large that so much of God's presence came and miracles just began to occur. It wasn't like the saints were like, bilocation, or multiplication of food, or reading souls. It was just the saints were so enamored by the presence of God that the divine started to come out from them. And so this whole work of descending deeper into the soul is actually a work to draw more of God into this world. Now, by us being aware of spiritual realities, it actually also means that we get to engage in the spiritual warfare that's going on around us all the time. When I'm doing my baptism prep with couples, I'll always talk about the reality of a lot of people will grant to their kids vaccines and things like this. And the reason they do this is they're trying to protect their children from an unseen enemy, some sort of a virus or a bacteria. And so they'll give them the vaccine in the hopes that they will not contract that disease. Baptism for us is a sort of almost spiritual vaccine. Is it's actually given to us, it infuses and changes our soul. And it actually, it protects us and gives us some of the graces to resist temptations to sin. It doesn't get rid of concupiscence, our desire for sin, but it actually gives us graces of faith, hope, and charity. And not only that, but we get the beautiful title of son or daughter of God. And so by engaging the spiritual work, we're actually taking advantage of what so many of us have already received in the water of baptism. And by engaging in these rules of discernment, we begin to see how to navigate. Am I giving myself more to God, to the world, to the devil, to myself? What spirit is the one that is operating and moving me? And hopefully that we as Christians can always say, well, what is operating most is the Spirit of God, and that's where I make my decisions. But in order to make those decisions, we need to know the landscape and the rules of discernment. So let's just look a little bit about who this Saint Ignatius of Loyola is. Now, Saint Ignatius of Loyola was alive in the late 1500s. And he came at a very important time in the church during the time of the Reformation. He is the founder of the Jesuits, which is a religious order maybe you've heard about. But Ignatius didn't start out so glorious. He was born of a noble family. He loved war. He loved battle. He loved the military. He loved nobility. And he had all these dreams of becoming a heroic knight or soldier or someone in the court of the king. Well, when Ignatius was leading a battle in Spain, he actually got hit by a cannonball in the leg. I'll talk about a day wrecker. Ignatius was on his convalescent bed, basically being nursed back to health and doctors by these nuns. And in this convent, which he was there for several months, the convent had very little except for spiritual nourishment, right? They were, of course, attending to his body, but when Ignatius was asking for books to read, they had two available to him: the life of Christ and the lives of the saints. And Ignatius was reading these texts, but after a while he's like, come on, do you got anything, a romance novel, anything like this? And the sisters were like, no, I'm sorry, this is all we have. So Ignatius would spend his time of convalescence going between fantasizing about all the heroic things he could do and winning these damsels in distress and getting awards from certain nobility and being ushered into court and all of these castles bestowed upon him. And he noticed that whenever he would imagine these things, they would fill him with a great desire, but then after a while it would just dissipate and leave him empty. Whereas when he read these spiritual works, they would set his soul on fire with a zeal that would abide and remain even after he stopped reading them. And so what Ignatius began to see is that there were spirits that were operative. Now, it would be pretty equivalent to us, like, for example, when we're in quarantine or social isolation, to literally say, okay, I just got done binging a Netflix series. And it was really cool. My mind was stimulated. It got rid of the time. And now I'm in like the Netflix hole where I'm just like, I don't know what I'm going to watch. I don't know what I'm going to do. Totally bummed, zoning out. And so what was once really exciting is now desolate. Whereas, and hopefully you've experienced this, right? Like you go to prayer, maybe you say like a rosary, you go for a walk, you read some of the scriptures, and you're like, oh my goodness, like you just feel this zeal and it just kind of abides and it stays for a longer period of time. Well, Ignatius of Loyola, despite having this experience and awareness, was still quite a vain man. And so after his leg had healed, he realized that it healed a little different than his other leg, and so he walked with a limp. And in Ignatius of Loyola's vanity, he actually had them re-break his leg, reset it, so that it would hopefully be normal size. Sadly, it was not the case, and Ignatius did walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But during the second round of convalescence, Ignatius began to more formally kind of reveal what these rules of discernment would be. So after he left the hospital, he then went to a cave where he entered into serious fasting and prayer. And this is where he wrote the exercises, is what he calls them. They're not actually like exercises to get, he wasn't doing PT, but he was doing these spiritual exercises that he would lead others in. And it's actually kind of the foundations of some of the Jesuits. It's the 30-day Ignatian retreat. With this comes his rules for discernment. And they were formalized during his time of fasting and prayer. Now, as just a side note, one of the greatest regrets in Ignatius's life is that he was so harsh with fasting and penances during this time of his life that he totally ruined his health. And because of it, he was not able to go on mission for the rest of his life. So Ignatius, in writing these rules for discernment, would articulate well how to go between consolations and desolations. We'll talk a little bit later about what these two things mean, but essentially what they are, just for this kind of beginner's knowledge, a consolation is a movement towards God. A desolation is a movement away from God. And we're not talking about like natural things, right? Like I'm consoled and so I'm really happy because someone made me a nice meal. Or I'm desolate because a friend didn't call me. We're talking about something along the spiritual movements. And so Ignatius, in his first 14 rules for discernment, just talks about navigating between desolations and consolations. But then he kind of one-ups it. And then with his second set of rules, which is 8 rules, again, we'll go through all these in a very timely manner, his second set of rules are discerning between consolations. Like, how do I know that what I want to do, I think it's a good idea? How do I know if it's just a good idea or if it's a divine inspiration? Or if it's the enemy disguising himself as an angel of light just to further lead me down the path of destruction? So part of my Institute for Priestly formation was actually to walk us through what is called the levels of the heart. Now, I realize these descriptions are backwards because I don't know how to fix the mirroring option on my computer. But what I want you to basically see is the levels of the heart. And so with this, right, there is the first level, which is basically the physical, just things around us, right? Pizza, I like pizza. I like good music. I like being around people. I like when someone returns a text that I send. These are sort of external things. So they're the most shallow parts. They're kind of like the courtyard of the senses, as Teresa of Avila would talk about. Then you go on to the next level. And this is like the psychological. So this is the things of the heart that are like, you know, I have a good connection with my family and my dad lives in Arizona, and whenever I see him, I get super excited and it just fills my heart with joy because I get to see someone that I know loves me and that I love them in return. Same thing with a good friend that you haven't seen for a while. It's the psychological level. Still not this deepest level that we're moving towards. Then the third level is we have spiritual thoughts and feelings. And this is where, right, we'll go to prayer and you've probably had this, like the ooey gooey moments, or you just feel maybe even very disturbed in soul, like something's wrong right now. These deeper levels of the soul are kind of where we're going at with the consolations and desolations. And then in the very center is the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And if we can access this place, we'll just be in perpetual consolation and dwelling in the presence of God. So that's the end goal. Now, in regards to this third level, which is the spiritual level, there is an acronym I'll use, B.U.T, but. Be aware, understand, and take action. And this is what we're going to want in the back of our minds as we're moving through these rules of discernment. To be aware, to understand, and then to take action. Now, the first principle, right, even before we begin the rules of discernment, is we actually have to be aware that something is going on inside of me. So often, right, we are just basically engaged with what the next best thing is. But now in this time where a lot of the distractions are removed, we're having to be aware of what's going on inside of ourselves. And maybe you've had this experience, right? As you're going so fast and someone says, hey, how are you? And you're like, I don't know. Let me just check in with myself quick. Because we're moving so fast, we oftentimes aren't even aware how we're doing. So the first step in discernment of spirits is actually to be aware that there are movements going on inside of us. Then the next one is to understand. So yes, okay, let's say we see something, and now we have to begin to say, okay, so what is it that's going on? Start to put words to it. And so there's an adage that I like from psychology that I'm going to use. If there is smoke, there must be fire. So if you see plumes of smoke, you can trace it down to something burning. So this is the same thing, right? So the be aware is, man, I'm like really agitated right now. Then we have to begin to understand, okay, let's trace the agitation and where does it come from? I might say like, oh, I'm just overworked, I'm so stressed out. But what I'm really agitated at is the fact that I don't have enough time to cook myself dinner and I gotta go to McDonald's again this week. And I'm really, really frustrated that I have not had a good meal. So now I'm agitated at everything, I'm filled with smoke, but I need to go down and to say, okay, what is really going on at the heart? I need to understand it. And then is the third part, the take action. Okay, so I see all the smoke, I'm aware of that there's smoke, I see what's burning, and now I actually have to do something to say, you know what, one more day at McDonald's isn't going to kill you, it's not the best thing, or, you know, maybe you should just get a smoothie. You can make those in like 5 minutes, you can have them any time of the day. My diet consists mostly of liquids right now, smoothies and the like, because we don't have a kitchen. And so it's just a planning thing. So the take action piece is absolutely essential. So I just want to take a moment right now, and here's an exercise that's really helpful. Is literally, and this comes from a psychologist actually that I was interacting with, and he said, so often we're not even in our bodies. We don't even know what our bodies are doing. So the first thing when you want to be aware of what's going on is put your hand on your heart and just feel your heart beating. And now that you've realized that you are in a body, you're not just in your mind, now just start to regulate your breathing. Now go in through your nose, 1, 2, 3, and then out through your mouth, 1, 2, 3, 4. In through your nose, 1, 2, 3, and then out through your mouth, 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you begin to feel yourself calm down, it's amazing. Just like if you stopped stirring up water, I think I read something where like the waters in Venice are cleaner than anyone has ever seen them in this lifetime because there's no one stirring up the water with the gondolas. And so they can see right down to the bottoms because no one's traveling right now. It's the same thing with the soul. It's literally just to calm ourselves down to say, okay, now I'm ready to see what's going on underneath. I'm ready to see the smoke. So be aware, understand, take action. So the last thing I'll mention before we end today, and then we'll go into the rules of discernment one video at a time, is that there are 3 things that we're interacting with. And this comes from the long tradition of saints and theology in the Catholic faith. Is there's the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so these 3 principles, once again, we're not talking about God or the Holy Spirit. We're talking about 3 things that would really kind of cloud our judgment and that we have to look at on the natural level. So the world are the things that distract us on a regular basis, which a lot of us have had a lot of them removed. The flesh is our own self, right? C.S. Lewis has this great imagery in his book, the Screwtape Letters. And there's this guy who's studying at the library, and suddenly he's reading something. He has like this epiphany. He's like, maybe God does exist. And then suddenly the enemy scrambles knowing that he's thinking about holy things. And it reminds him, hey, the bus is about to leave. And aren't you hungry? Feel how hungry your stomach is. And you don't want to waste this time. Go catch the bus and go get a meal. And the man immediately leaves the inspiration and follows the flesh. So this is a real possibility that the flesh would kind of captivate us. And then there is the reality of the devil as well. All of us love to believe in angels. We don't so much like to believe on the other side, is that there is demonic powers that are trying to sway us from growing in union. And so as we take these rules of discernment, just realize that these are some of the powers that we're warring against: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And these rules of discernment will assist us to keep the guardrails up and to navigate that movement of the Spirit and to resist the enemy's promptings. That is enough for today, and I look forward to updating you hopefully to more videos in the future. God bless.